The latest revelations from the Young and the Restless expose a dangerous disconnect between perception and reality. One that has quietly reshaped the balance of power in Genoa City and pushed several of its most influential figures toward irreversible consequences. Beginning with Kane Ashby's fundamental misunderstanding of Victor Newman. Kane never believed that Victor could descend into outright criminal behavior, let alone operate like a gangster pulling strings from the shadows. Yet the audience has long understood that Kane's perception of Victor has always been filtered through denial, pride, and a refusal to acknowledge how far the Newman patriarch is willing to go when control slips through his fingers. That miscalculation has proven catastrophic, because Victor did not act out of chaos or impulse as Kane assumed, but with calculated restraint, delegating his most controversial moves to others while maintaining plausible deniability, a strategy that ultimately left Kane reacting to illusions rather than facts. Contrary to what Kane believed and feared, Victor never kidnapped Lily Winters or their twins, an assumption that reveals more about Kane's own guilt and paranoia than Victor's actual actions. Instead, Victor chose a subtler, more insidious path by enlisting Adam Newman to locate Kane's family, not to harm them but to position himself several steps ahead on the board. This distinction matters because it marks the precise moment Victor crossed from being perceived as a ruthless businessman into something far more unsettling. A man who understands that fear does not require violence, only uncertainty. Kane's failure to grasp this nuance led him to respond emotionally rather than strategically, reinforcing Victor's advantage while simultaneously alienating Lily, whose tolerance for manipulation had already been stretched to its limit by the events of the previous summer. The true turning point, however, came when Nikki Newman uncovered Victor's maneuver at the last possible moment, without his knowledge, proving once again that Nikki remains the only person capable of reading Victor clearly even when he believes himself invincible. Her decision to intervene quietly rather than confront Victor directly was not an act of loyalty but of containment, because Nikki understood that Victor's plan would only succeed if Lily remained in the dark. By warning Adam that Lily needed to be informed and persuaded to cooperate rather than coerced, Nikki attempted to redirect the outcome without triggering Victor's wrath. A delicate balancing act that underscores how deeply she understands the man she has spent a lifetime surviving. In doing so, Nikki exposed Victor's first major error, not in execution but in assumption, because he underestimated how many variables he could truly control. That miscalculation cannot be separated from Kane's own history of destruction, particularly the disaster he orchestrated the previous summer. A catastrophe so severe that it resulted in 3 deaths for which Kane ultimately accepted responsibility. While Kane framed this confession as accountability, Lily saw it for what it truly was, an admission that arrived too late and solved nothing. Lily's dissatisfaction was not rooted in anger alone but in exhaustion, because Kane's pattern of unilateral decisions followed by emotional apologies had become a cycle she could no longer endure. This history explains why Lily's influence over Kane during the arabesque crisis carried such weight, as it was born not from trust but from desperation. A final attempt to prevent him from repeating the same fatal mistake under a different banner. Kane's refusal to follow Colin Atkinson's original objective marked a rare deviation from his usual trajectory, one driven not by moral clarity but by Lily's intervention. Arabesque's artificial intelligence weapon represented a line Kane had not yet crossed, and Lily's insistence that the technology be handed over to her instead of deployed forced Kane to choose between legacy and restraint. His decision to comply suggested growth on the surface, yet it also exposed a dangerous vulnerability, because Kane failed to ensure that Lily would actually be able to destroy the program. That oversight became the fulcrum upon which the entire conflict pivoted, transforming a near disaster into an uncontrollable escalation once Phyllis Summers entered the equation. Phyllis's theft of the artificial intelligence program was not an impulsive act but a calculated move driven by survival, ambition, and a long-standing belief that she alone understands how power truly works in Genoa City. By stealing the technology from Lily before it could be destroyed, Phyllis positioned herself as the ultimate broker, offering Victor the one weapon he could not resist. Victor's acceptance of the deal, sealed only by a verbal promise to install Phyllis at the helm of Jabot, exposed the very flaw that has undone him repeatedly: his obsession with defeating Jack Abbott at any cost. In his hunger for revenge, Victor ignored the instability of the alliance he was forming. mistaking Phyllis's opportunism for loyalty and underestimating the ripple effects of consolidating power through stolen technology rather than earned authority. That decision would prove to be Victor's most consequential mistake, because the acquisition of the artificial intelligence program did not strengthen his empire but hollowed it out from within. Victor's fixation on Jack blinded him to the broader implications of wielding a weapon that destabilized trust across corporate and personal boundaries alike, ultimately accelerating the collapse of Newman Enterprises rather than preventing it. What Victor believed would be the final move in a decades-long chess match instead triggered a chain reaction that stripped him of the very institution he had built his identity around, forcing him to confront a reality he has spent his life denying: that power taken through fear is never permanent. Amid this unraveling, Lily Winters emerged as an unexpected axis of influence, not because she sought dominance but because others underestimated her endurance. While the audience is aware of the real-world circumstances surrounding Crystal Khalil's maternity leave and potential extended absence, the narrative solution of removing Lily from Genoa City carries emotional and thematic weight beyond logistical necessity. Lily's departure fractures her already fragile bond with Kane, exposing how irreparably their relationship has been damaged by years of conflicting loyalties and unhealed betrayals. Their twice-married history, once defined by intimacy and shared purpose, now stands as evidence that love alone cannot survive when trust is repeatedly compromised. Lily's inability to accept Kane's continued association with Phyllis, both professionally and personally, crystallizes the central conflict between them, because it represents more than jealousy or resentment. For Lily, Phyllis embodies every warning sign Kane has chosen to ignore, a reminder that he gravitates toward chaos even when stability is within reach. This realization forces Lily to confront a painful truth, that protecting herself and her children may require distance rather than reconciliation. A decision that deepens the emotional rift while reinforcing Lily's quiet authority within the narrative. Her influence persists even in absence, shaping decisions, exposing weaknesses, and leaving behind a vacuum that others rush to fill, often with disastrous results. In the end, the tragedy unfolding across Genoa City is not the result of a single betrayal or misstep but of intersecting ambitions and resolved vendettas, and the persistent illusion that control can be reclaimed once lost. Kane's misjudgment of Victor, Victor's obsession with Jack, Phyllis's opportunism, and Lily's weary resolve all converge into a cautionary tale about power exercised without accountability and love strained beyond repair. As the fallout continues to spread, one truth becomes increasingly clear: in the young and the restless, the most devastating consequences are rarely born from outright villainy, but from the quiet certainty that one knows better than everyone else, right up until the moment everything collapses. The unraveling of Kane Ashby's position in Genoa City did not begin with Victor Newman's maneuvers, nor with the artificial intelligence scandal that followed, but with Kane's own lack of discipline, a flaw that has haunted him throughout his history and has once again proven decisive. Stripped of Lily's trust and rejected by his children, Kane reached a psychological breaking point where restraint no longer mattered. And in that vacuum he reverted to the alliances that had once empowered him and just as often destroyed him, gravitating back toward Phyllis Summers and Billy Abbott. This return was not strategic brilliance but emotional reflex, a familiar pattern in which Kane, feeling cornered and abandoned, assembled a team that mirrored his inner chaos rather than challenged it. With nothing left to protect, Kane convinced himself he had nothing left to lose, and that belief became the most dangerous lie he told himself, because it justified every reckless move that followed. From Kane's perspective, everything might have unfolded smoothly with Victor Newman if Lily had agreed to Victor's kidnapping plan. A hypothetical that reveals just how far Kane had drifted from reality. The very fact that Kane could imagine Lily cooperating in such a scheme underscores his fundamental misunderstanding of her character and values. And it also highlights Victor's own miscalculation in assuming that persuasion could substitute for consent. Lily's refusal was not merely a personal boundary but a narrative correction, preventing the storyline from sliding into outright implausibility and exposing the moral fault lines that separate manipulation from complicity. Without Lily's cooperation, Victor's plan lost its most critical stabilizing element, forcing him to pivot toward intimidation and brute leverage. a move that further alienated Kane even as it appeared to strengthen Victor's hand. At the heart of the conflict lies the artificial intelligence tool itself, a narrative device that has grown increasingly contentious among viewers and within the logic of the show. There is a growing sense that the story has reached saturation with this technology, and that the AI must be dismantled not only within the plot but conceptually, before it overwhelms the human stakes that define daytime drama. Soap operas have always reflected contemporary anxieties, embedding them into personal stories to maintain relevance. And it is therefore understandable that The Young and the Restless would frame artificial intelligence as an emerging, almost apocalyptic force capable of outmaneuvering every human in Genoa City. Yet the longer this device remains unchecked, the more it risks eroding the emotional realism that keeps audiences invested, turning complex characters into pawns of an abstract threat rather than agents of their own downfall. This tension becomes especially pronounced in the idea of Kane taking over Newman Enterprises alongside Phyllis, a scenario that pushes audience trust to its absolute limit. While power shifts are a staple of the genre, they rely on a sense of earned inevitability. And this particular configuration strains credibility because it contradicts decades of established hierarchy. Newman Enterprises is not merely a corporation within the show, it is an extension of Victor Newman's identity, a symbol of dominance that has defined Genoa City for generations. To see Kane ascend to that throne, with Phyllis positioned as his counterpart, risks feeling less like dramatic evolution and more like narrative provocation. A deliberate attempt to shock rather than persuade. For many viewers, that suspension of disbelief has already cracked. And the longer this arrangement persists, the harder it becomes to maintain emotional buy-in. The hope, therefore, is that Kane will ultimately comply with Victor's demands or that Newman Enterprises will return to Victor's control in the near future, restoring a sense of narrative gravity. It is difficult to reconcile a Genoa City in which Victor Newman is not the dominant force, especially given his long-standing role as the town's immovable center of power. Wisconsin's most infamous mustache has been synonymous with authority for so long that its absence feels less like change and more like dissonance. The notion of an old character like Kane reclaiming the crown, with Phyllis reigning beside him, may sound provocative on paper. But in practice it risks undermining the very mythology that sustains the show, replacing earned legacy with temporary spectacle. Yet Victor is not unaware of this instability, and his response has been anything but passive. Having warned Kane and Phyllis of their impending collapse, Victor has adopted a posture that borders on gangster theatrics, leaning into intimidation and raw force as if daring his enemies to underestimate him. This shift is not a reinvention of Victor's character but an amplification of traits that have always been present, now stripped of the corporate polish that once masked them. By playing hardball and embracing the role of an underworld enforcer, Victor signals that he is willing to burn every bridge if it means reclaiming what he believes is rightfully his. A stance that injects both menace and inevitability into the unfolding conflict. There is a poetic quality to the suggestion that Victor's enemies will be defeated by spring, when the ice melts and the ground softens, because it frames the storyline as a seasonal reckoning rather than an endless stalemate. Winter, in this context, becomes a metaphor for suspension and false power, a period where natural arrangements can exist because nothing is moving forward. When the thaw arrives, so too will consequences, dissolving alliances built on fear and opportunism, and revealing which structures were solid enough to endure change. Whether Kane and Phyllis can survive that thaw remains doubtful, especially given the fragile foundation of their partnership and the unresolved moral cost of their ascent. Ultimately, this chapter of The Young and the Restless hinges on restraint, or the lack thereof, both in character behavior and narrative ambition. Kane's failure to maintain discipline set him on a path of regression rather than growth, while Victor's overreach with the artificial intelligence storyline threatens to eclipse the human drama that made his character iconic. The resolution does not require bigger twists or more powerful technology, but a return to consequences grounded in emotion, loyalty, and loss. Only by breaking the AI tool and restoring agency to its characters can the story reclaim its balance, reminding viewers that in Genoa City, the most destructive force has never been technology, but the belief that power excuses everything.